The train pulled into Camp Shelby, Mississippi on a sweltering August afternoon in 1943. Through the barred windows of the cattle car, 23-year-old Lieutenant Giuseppe Benedetti pressed his face against the hot metal, trying to catch his first glimpse of America. What he saw defied everything he had been told about his enemy. American soldiers were lounging in the shade, drinking from dark glass bottles and laughing. Some were eating what looked like sausages wrapped in bread. The scene was so casual, so abundant, so utterly different from the war-torn landscapes of North Africa, where he had been captured just 3 months earlier. Benedetti had expected a harsh, industrial wasteland. Fascist propaganda had painted America as a nation of soulless capitalists, where workers toiled in misery while their bosses grew fat on the profits of war. Instead, he was seeing something that seemed almost impossible: enemy soldiers who appeared well-fed, relaxed, and genuinely content. As the train screeched to a halt and American guards began unlocking the car doors, Benedetti caught a whiff of something extraordinary: the sweet caramel scent of Coca-Cola mixing with the smoky aroma of grilled meat. This was his introduction to an America that would shatter every preconception he had carried across the Atlantic. For Giuseppe Benedetti and hundreds of thousands of other Axis prisoners of war, their captivity in America would become an unexpected journey of discovery, a revelation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemy and ultimately about themselves. The story of Axis prisoners of war in America during World War II is one of the most remarkable and least-known chapters of the conflict. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States housed over 425,000 enemy prisoners on American soil, more than any other Allied nation. Among them were approximately 51,000 Italians and 3,000 Hungarians, men who had fought for fascist regimes, but who would discover in their captivity a side of America that their own governments had desperately tried to hide from them. These prisoners arrived expecting brutality, starvation, and the harsh treatment that propaganda had promised they would receive. Instead, they found themselves in a country where even prisoners of war were fed better than many civilians back home, where guards shared cigarettes and stories, and where strange new foods and drinks revealed the abundance of a nation that seemed to have turned war production into an engine of prosperity rather than sacrifice. The journey that brought these men to American soil had begun in the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Italy, where Axis forces had fought desperately against the advancing Allied armies. For the Italians, the war had started with Mussolini's grandiose dreams of a new Roman Empire, but by 1943, those dreams had turned into a nightmare of defeat and retreat. The Italian Eighth Army had been decimated in North Africa, and when the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, Italian resistance began to crumble. Lieutenant Benedetti had been part of the Italian forces defending Tunisia when the Africa Corps finally collapsed in May 1943. He had watched German and Italian units surrender en masse as Allied forces closed the trap around the remaining Axis forces. The surrender had come almost as a relief after months of fighting with dwindling supplies, inadequate equipment, and the growing realization that the war was lost. The Hungarian prisoners had a different story. Hungary had been reluctantly drawn into the war as a German ally, more out of fear of Soviet expansion than any genuine enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. Hungarian forces had fought primarily on the Eastern Front, where they had witnessed the brutal reality of the war against the Soviet Union. Many Hungarian soldiers had been captured during the disastrous retreat from Stalingrad or during subsequent operations where Hungarian units were used as cannon fodder by their German allies. For both groups, capture had initially seemed like a death sentence. Axis propaganda had painted the Americans as ruthless enemies who would torture and execute prisoners. Stories circulated of Allied atrocities, of prisoners being worked to death in labor camps, of systematic brutality that awaited anyone unfortunate enough to fall into enemy hands. These fears were compounded by the long journey to America itself, weeks spent in overcrowded ships, uncertain of their destination or their fate. The reality they encountered was so different from their expectations that many prisoners initially suspected it was an elaborate deception. The Geneva Convention, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, required that POWs be housed and fed at standards equivalent to those of the captor nation's own troops. But America in 1943 was experiencing an unprecedented economic boom, and the standard of living for American soldiers, and by extension their prisoners, was higher than anything most Europeans had experienced even before the war. The first shock came with the food. American military rations in 1943 included fresh meat, white bread, butter, coffee, and sugar, luxuries that had disappeared from European tables years earlier. But it wasn't just the quantity of food that amazed the prisoners. It was the casual abundance of it. American guards would throw away half-eaten sandwiches, pour out coffee that had grown cold, and discard cigarettes that were barely smoked. To men who had spent years under wartime rationing, this waste seemed almost criminal. Then came the Coca-Cola. For most Italian and Hungarian prisoners, this dark, fizzy drink was their first encounter with American consumer culture. The very existence of Coca-Cola seemed to embody everything that was different about America. Here was a beverage that served no nutritional purpose, that existed purely for pleasure, and that was so abundant that even prisoners could have it. The sweet, effervescent taste was unlike anything they had experienced, and the fact that American soldiers drank it constantly suggested a society where such luxuries were taken for granted. Hot dogs presented another cultural revelation. These simple sausages, served in soft buns with mustard and relish, represented a democratization of food that was foreign to European sensibilities. In Italy and Hungary, sausages were often expensive delicacies, carefully prepared and served on special occasions. In America, hot dogs were casual food, eaten at baseball games and street corners, available to anyone with a few cents. The idea that such food could be so common, so accessible, challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and economic distribution. Camp Shelby, where Lieutenant Benedetti found himself, was typical of the POW facilities that housed Axis prisoners across America. Located in rural Mississippi, the camp had been hastily constructed to accommodate the flood of prisoners arriving from North Africa and later from the Italian campaign. The barracks were simple but adequate, with proper heating, electricity and sanitation, amenities that many of the prisoners had lacked even in their home countries before the war. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but the atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. American guards, many of them young men who had never traveled far from their own hometowns, were often as curious about their prisoners as the prisoners were about America. Language barriers were gradually overcome through gestures, shared cigarettes, and the universal language of humor. Many guards had Italian or Hungarian ancestry and could communicate in broken versions of their ancestral languages. The daily routine at Camp Shelby reflected the American approach to prisoner management, which emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. Prisoners were required to work, as mandated by the Geneva Convention, but the work was generally not onerous. They might help with camp maintenance, work in the kitchens, or assist with agricultural projects in the surrounding area. The wages they earned, paid in camp scrip, could be used to purchase additional food, cigarettes, and personal items from the camp canteen. It was in these canteens that many prisoners had their most profound encounters with American abundance. The shelves were stocked with items that had been unavailable in Europe for years: chocolate bars, chewing gum, soap, toothpaste, and magazines. The prisoners could buy Coca-Cola by the bottle, along with other American soft drinks that seemed to exist in endless variety. The very concept of choice, being able to select from multiple brands of the same product, was a revelation to men from societies where scarcity had made such choices impossible. The cultural exchange that took place in these camps was unprecedented in the history of warfare. American guards learned about European history, art, and culture from educated prisoners who had been teachers, engineers, and professionals in civilian life. In return, the prisoners received an education in American values and way of life that no amount of propaganda could have provided. They learned about democracy, free enterprise, and individual liberty not through lectures, but through daily observation of how Americans lived and worked. Music became a particularly important bridge between cultures. Italian prisoners organized opera performances and classical concerts, while American guards introduced them to jazz, swing, and popular music. The camp at Shelby had a prisoner orchestra that performed both European classical pieces and American popular songs. These musical exchanges created bonds that transcended the formal prisoner-guard relationship and helped humanize both sides of the conflict. Sports provided another avenue for cultural exchange. Baseball, that most American of games, became popular among many prisoners who had never seen it played. American guards organized teams and taught the rules, while prisoners introduced Americans to soccer and other European sports. These games became social events that brought together prisoners and guards in a spirit of friendly competition that seemed to make the war feel very far away. The letters that prisoners were allowed to send home, heavily censored but still personal, began to carry news of their treatment that contradicted everything their families had been told about American brutality. Giuseppe Benedetti wrote to his mother in Naples, "The Americans feed us better than we ate at home before the war. They give us meat every day and bread that is white as snow. There is a drink here called Coca-Cola that tastes like liquid candy. I cannot understand how they can afford to give such things to their enemies." These letters, when they reached Europe, created confusion and disbelief among families and communities that had been told America was a land of oppression and want. Some recipients assumed the letters were forgeries, created by American propaganda services to demoralize the home front. Others wondered if their loved ones had been brainwashed or coerced into writing positive things about their captivity. The truth, that America's abundance was real and that prisoners were genuinely being treated well, was almost too extraordinary to believe. The Hungarian prisoners had their own unique perspective on American abundance. Hungary had been a predominantly agricultural society, and many Hungarian POWs were farmers or rural workers who understood the challenges of food production. They were amazed by American agricultural techniques, mechanization, and the efficiency of food distribution systems. The fact that fresh milk, meat, and vegetables were available year-round seemed almost miraculous to men from a country where seasonal scarcity was a fact of life. The psychological impact of this abundance on the prisoners was profound. Many began to question everything they had been told about the war, about America, and about their own governments. If America could afford to feed its enemies so well, what did that say about the relative strength of the opposing sides? If American soldiers seemed so content and well cared for, what did that suggest about the nature of American society? These questions would have far-reaching consequences for the prisoners' post-war lives and their understanding of the conflict they had been part of. The American government was well aware of the propaganda value of treating prisoners well. The Office of War Information carefully documented conditions in POW camps, knowing that word of good treatment would eventually reach Europe and potentially encourage more enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. But the good treatment wasn't just propaganda. It reflected genuine American values about human dignity and the rule of law, even in wartime. The abundance that so amazed the prisoners was itself a product of America's unique position in the war. Unlike Europe, America's homeland was untouched by bombing or invasion. American factories were producing at unprecedented levels, not just for the military, but for civilian consumption as well. The war had ended the Great Depression and created full employment, rising wages, and a standard of living that was higher than ever before. This prosperity was visible even in the treatment of prisoners who benefited from the general abundance of American society. As 1943 turned into 1944, the prisoners at camps like Shelby began to settle into routines that would have been unimaginable at the start of their captivity. They attended classes in English, participated in educational programs, and some even began to plan for their eventual return home. But many were beginning to wonder what kind of home they would return to, and whether the societies they had left behind could ever match the abundance and freedom they were experiencing as prisoners in America. The story of Giuseppe Benedetti and his fellow prisoners was just beginning. Their encounter with Coca-Cola and hot dogs was more than just a cultural curiosity. It was the opening chapter of a transformation that would challenge their understanding of the world and their place in it. As they settled into their new lives behind barbed wire in Mississippi, they had no idea that their greatest revelations about America and about themselves were still to come. The abundance they had discovered was real, but it was only the surface of a much deeper story about democracy, freedom, and the power of ideas to transcend the boundaries of war. Their journey from enemies to reluctant admirers of American society would continue to unfold in ways that would surprise both the prisoners and their captors, creating bonds and insights that would last long after the war had ended. The morning of September 8, 1943, brought news that would forever change the lives of Italian prisoners in American camps. Italy had surrendered. The announcement crackled over camp radios at facilities from Texas to New York, and suddenly thousands of Italian POWs found themselves in a strange limbo, no longer enemies but not quite allies either. At Camp Shelby, Lieutenant Giuseppe Benedetti sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. His country had abandoned the war, abandoned Mussolini, and abandoned him and his fellow soldiers to an uncertain fate in a foreign land. The reaction among Italian prisoners was mixed and complex. Some felt relief that the war was finally over for their homeland. Others felt betrayed by a government that had first led them into an unwinnable conflict and then abandoned them without consultation or warning. But perhaps most significantly, many began to realize that their captivity in America might last much longer than they had originally expected. What had seemed like a temporary imprisonment was becoming an extended residence in a country they were only beginning to understand. The Hungarian prisoners watched these developments with their own mixture of emotions. Hungary remained technically at war with the Allies, but the writing was on the wall. The Soviet advance on the Eastern Front was accelerating, and it was becoming clear that Hungary would soon face a choice between continued alliance with Germany or surrender to the advancing Red Army. For Hungarian POWs in America, this prospect was particularly troubling. Unlike the Italians, who might eventually return to a liberated homeland, the Hungarians faced the possibility of returning to a country occupied by the Soviet Union. The American authorities handled the Italian surrender with characteristic pragmatism. Italian prisoners were given the option of joining the Italian service units, auxiliary forces that would work alongside American troops in non-combat roles. This offered them a chance to contribute to the war effort against their former German allies while remaining on American soil. Many Italians accepted this opportunity, seeing it as a way to redeem themselves and their country's honor, while continuing to experience the American way of life that had so impressed them. For those who chose to join the service units, the transformation was remarkable. They traded their prisoner uniforms for American military clothing, moved from barbed wire compounds to regular military barracks, and began working alongside American soldiers as partners rather than captives. The psychological impact of this change was profound. Men who had been enemies just months earlier were now sharing meals, working side by side, and developing genuine friendships with their former captors. Private Antonio Rossi, a former Italian infantryman who had been captured in Sicily, found himself working in the kitchens at Camp Shelby alongside American cooks. "At first, I was amazed by how much food the Americans threw away," he later recalled. "Whole loaves of bread barely touched. Cans of meat that were past their prime but still perfectly good. I asked my American supervisor why they didn't save these things, and he looked at me like I was crazy. There's plenty more where that came from," he said. "That's when I began to understand that America was different from anywhere I had ever been." The abundance that had initially shocked the prisoners became a daily reality that they gradually learned to take for granted. The camp canteens expanded their offerings, stocking not just necessities, but luxuries that would have been unimaginable in wartime Europe. Prisoners could buy ice cream, candy bars, and soft drinks in varieties they had never known existed. The Coca-Cola, that had seemed so exotic upon their arrival, became as routine as water, consumed casually throughout the day by prisoners who had learned to appreciate its refreshing qualities in the Mississippi heat. Hot dogs evolved from a curiosity into a beloved staple. Italian prisoners, with their sophisticated culinary traditions, initially looked down on these simple sausages as crude peasant food. But the American approach to hot dogs, the endless variety of toppings, the casual social atmosphere of hot dog stands, the democratic nature of a food that was equally enjoyed by generals and privates, gradually won them over. Some Italian prisoners even began experimenting with their own variations, adding Mediterranean herbs and spices to create fusion dishes that reflected their evolving cultural identity. The educational programs offered to prisoners became increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. American authorities recognized that these men would eventually return to Europe and could serve as ambassadors for American values and democratic ideals. English language classes were expanded, and prisoners were introduced to American history, civics, and political philosophy. Many discovered concepts of individual liberty and democratic governance that were entirely foreign to their experience under fascist regimes. Captain James Morrison, the education officer at Camp Shelby, observed the transformation of his students with fascination. These men arrived believing that democracy was weakness, that individual freedom led to chaos, and that only strong authoritarian leadership could maintain order, he noted in his official reports. But as they lived among Americans, as they saw how our society functioned, many began to question these assumptions. They saw that Americans could disagree politically without violence, that workers could organize without destroying the economy, and that individual freedom actually strengthened rather than weakened the social fabric. The prisoners' exposure to American popular culture was equally transformative. Hollywood movies were shown regularly in the camps, giving prisoners their first glimpse of American entertainment and values. Films like Casablanca and The Best Years of Our Lives presented complex moral narratives that challenged the simplistic propaganda they had been fed about American society. The movies showed Americans grappling with difficult ethical choices, displaying both heroism and human frailty in ways that made them seem more real and relatable than the caricatures of fascist propaganda. Music continued to serve as a bridge between cultures. The camp orchestras that had begun as simple entertainment evolved into sophisticated cultural institutions. Italian prisoners with musical training found themselves in high demand, teaching American soldiers about opera and classical music while learning about jazz and popular music in return. The Hungarian prisoners, many of whom came from a culture with rich folk music traditions, introduced Americans to the haunting melodies and complex rhythms of Eastern European music. These cultural exchanges had unexpected consequences. American soldiers who had never traveled beyond their home states found themselves learning about European art, literature, and philosophy from educated prisoners who had been teachers, lawyers, and engineers in civilian life. The stereotypes that both sides had held about each other began to break down as personal relationships developed. Americans discovered that their enemies were not the faceless monsters of wartime propaganda, but ordinary men with families, dreams, and fears, much like their own. The letters that prisoners sent home became increasingly detailed and enthusiastic about their experiences. Giuseppe Benedetti wrote to his sister in Rome, "You ask me what America is really like, and I struggle to explain it in words you would believe. Yesterday, I went with an American guard to a place called a drugstore in the nearby town. It was like a palace of abundance. They sell not just medicine, but food, drinks, books, toys, and 100 other things I cannot even name. The American people walk through these stores as if such abundance is normal, as if having choices between dozens of different products is their birthright. I am beginning to understand why they are winning this war." These letters, when they reached Europe, created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate families of the prisoners. In Italian communities devastated by war, bombing, and occupation, the descriptions of American abundance seemed like fairy tales. Some recipients shared the letters with neighbors and friends, spreading word of the extraordinary conditions their loved ones were experiencing. This grassroots intelligence about American society began to undermine fascist propaganda even in areas still under German control. The work programs in which prisoners participated provided another window into American society. Italian prisoners worked on farms throughout the South and Midwest, helping to harvest crops that fed both the American war effort and civilian population. They were amazed by the mechanization of American agriculture, the efficiency of transportation systems, and the prosperity of even small farming communities. Hungarian prisoners, many of whom came from agricultural backgrounds, were particularly impressed by American farming techniques and the standard of living enjoyed by American farmers. The treatment of prisoners by civilian Americans was perhaps the most surprising aspect of their experience. In towns near POW camps, local residents often interacted with prisoners who were working on community projects or shopping in local stores as part of work details. Rather than the hostility that prisoners expected, they often encountered curiosity, kindness, and even friendship. American civilians would strike up conversations, share food, and sometimes invite prisoners to their homes for meals. Mrs. Sarah Johnson, who lived near Camp Shelby, became friends with several Italian prisoners who worked on her family's farm. "At first, my husband was skeptical about having enemy soldiers working our land," she later recalled. "But these boys, and that's what they were really, just boys far from home, were so polite, so grateful for any kindness that we couldn't help but like them. They taught my children some Italian songs, and they were always eager to help with any task, no matter how small. By the end of the war, we thought of them as part of our extended family." The psychological transformation of the prisoners was gradual but profound. Men who had arrived expecting brutality and deprivation found themselves living better than they ever had, even in peacetime. The cognitive dissonance was enormous. How could their enemies treat them so well? How could a society at war maintain such abundance? How could individual Americans be so generous and kind while their governments were locked in mortal combat? Some prisoners struggled with feelings of guilt about their comfortable circumstances, while their families back home faced hardship and danger. Others began to question the ideologies that had led them into war in the first place. If America was truly the decadent, materialistic society that fascist propaganda claimed, why were Americans sharing their abundance even with their enemies? If democracy was truly weak and ineffective, how had democratic America become so powerful and prosperous? The Hungarian prisoners faced particular psychological challenges as news from the Eastern Front grew increasingly grim. Reports of Soviet advances, of Hungarian units being decimated, and of the approaching occupation of their homeland created a sense of despair that contrasted sharply with their comfortable circumstances in America. Many began to realize that they might never see their families again, that the Hungary they had known might cease to exist entirely. Sergeant István Nagy, a Hungarian prisoner at Camp Shelby, expressed these conflicted feelings in a letter to his wife. "I am safe and well fed while you face dangers I cannot imagine. The Americans treat us better than our own officers ever did, and I am ashamed to admit that I am grateful for this captivity. But I fear for you, for our children, for our country. The world we knew is ending, and I do not know what will replace it." The religious dimension of the prisoners' experience added another layer of complexity to their transformation. Many Italian prisoners were devout Catholics who found comfort in the fact that America, despite its Protestant majority, respected their religious beliefs and provided Catholic chaplains for their spiritual needs. The separation of church and state in America, which allowed for religious freedom without government interference, was a revelation to men from societies where religion and politics were closely intertwined. Hungarian prisoners, many of whom came from Protestant or Catholic backgrounds, were similarly impressed by American religious tolerance. They attended services alongside American soldiers, participated in interfaith discussions, and discovered that Americans could hold strong religious beliefs while still respecting the rights of those who believed differently. This model of religious coexistence was entirely foreign to their experience in Europe, where religious differences had often been sources of conflict and persecution. The approach of 1945 brought new uncertainties and anxieties for the prisoners. The war in Europe was clearly nearing its end, and questions about repatriation became increasingly urgent. For Italian prisoners who had joined the service units, the prospect of return was complicated by their collaboration with American forces. Would they be welcomed back in Italy, or would they be seen as traitors who had betrayed their country by working with the enemy? The Hungarian prisoners faced even more complex dilemmas. As Soviet forces occupied Hungary, it became clear that repatriation might mean imprisonment or worse under a communist regime. Many Hungarian prisoners began to explore the possibility of remaining in America permanently, seeking ways to immigrate legally rather than return to an uncertain fate in their homeland. The American authorities handled these complex situations with characteristic pragmatism and humanity. Immigration laws were modified to allow some prisoners to remain in the United States, particularly those who had demonstrated strong democratic values and could contribute to American society. Others were given assistance in relocating to third countries where they might find safety and opportunity. The economic impact of the POW program on local American communities was significant and largely positive. Prisoners provided essential labor for agriculture and industry at a time when American workers were serving overseas or working in defense plants. Their wages, though modest, circulated through local economies, supporting businesses and creating jobs for American civilians. The cultural exchange also enriched American communities, introducing new foods, music, and traditions that would become permanent parts of the American cultural landscape. As the war drew to a close, the transformation of the prisoners was nearly complete. Men who had arrived as enemies had become friends, students, and in some cases, future Americans. They had experienced democracy not as an abstract political theory, but as a lived reality. They had seen abundance, not as propaganda, but as daily experience. They had encountered tolerance, generosity, and human dignity in circumstances where they had expected only hardship and humiliation. The story of Giuseppe Benedetti, Antonio Rossi, Istvan Nagy, and thousands of others like them was approaching its climax. Their encounter with Coca-Cola and hot dogs had been just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about America, about democracy, and about themselves. As the final chapter of their American experience approached, they faced choices that would determine not just their own futures, but the future of the societies they would help to rebuild in post-war Europe. The spring of 1946 brought a bittersweet awakening to the POW camps scattered across America. The war had been over for nearly a year, but for thousands of Italian and Hungarian prisoners, the question of home had become infinitely more complicated than simply boarding a ship back to Europe. Lieutenant Giuseppe Benedetti stood at the fence of Camp Shelby one final time, watching American soldiers play baseball in the distance, the crack of the bat mixing with the sound of laughter that had become the soundtrack of his captivity. In his pocket was a letter from his family in Naples, describing a city in ruins, where black market cigarettes cost more than his father's monthly pension, and where the abundance he had grown accustomed to in Mississippi seemed like a distant dream. The repatriation process that began in earnest in 1946 was unlike anything in military history. These were not just prisoners being returned to their homelands. They were cultural ambassadors, carrying with them 3 years of lived experience in American society. They had witnessed democracy in action, experienced economic abundance, and formed personal relationships that transcended the boundaries of war. Now they faced the challenge of reconciling these experiences with the realities of post-war Europe. For the Italian prisoners, the return journey began with a profound sense of loss. Many had expected to feel joy at the prospect of seeing their families again, but instead they found themselves mourning the end of an experience that had fundamentally changed them. The America they were leaving behind was not the enemy nation they had been taught to hate, but a country that had shown them possibilities they had never imagined. The abundance they had taken for granted, the daily Coca-Cola, the casual hot dogs, the endless variety of consumer goods, would soon become memories of a different world. The ship that carried Giuseppe Benedetti back to Italy in June 1946 was crowded with former prisoners, each carrying his own collection of American souvenirs and memories. They traded stories during the long Atlantic crossing, comparing their experiences at different camps, debating what they had learned, and wondering what kind of reception awaited them at home. Some carried letters of recommendation from American officers, hoping these testimonials might help them find work in the devastated Italian economy. Others had learned enough English to serve as translators or guides for the American aid workers who were beginning to arrive in Europe. The Italy that greeted Benedetti was almost unrecognizable from the country he had left 3 years earlier. Naples bore the scars of Allied bombing and German occupation. Buildings stood in ruins, infrastructure was destroyed, and the population struggled with shortages of food, fuel, and basic necessities. The contrast with the abundance he had experienced in America was stark and depressing. His first meal at home consisted of thin soup and black bread, a far cry from the steaks and white bread that had been routine at Camp Shelby. But Benedetti and his fellow returnees brought more than just memories of American abundance. They carried with them new ideas about democracy, individual rights, and economic organization. In the cafes and piazzas of Italian cities, former POWs became informal teachers, describing what they had seen of American society and challenging traditional assumptions about politics and economics. Their first-hand accounts of American democracy carried a credibility that no amount of propaganda could match. The impact of these returning prisoners on Italian society was profound and lasting. Many became advocates for democratic reform, drawing on their American experiences to argue for political changes that would bring Italy closer to the American model. They spoke about the importance of individual liberty, the benefits of free enterprise, and the possibility of creating a society where abundance was shared rather than hoarded by elites. Their voices added to the chorus of democratic forces that would shape Italy's post-war reconstruction. Antonio Rossi, the former cook who had worked alongside Americans at Camp Shelby, returned to his hometown near Milan with plans to open a restaurant. But this would not be a traditional Italian trattoria. Rossi wanted to introduce his neighbors to some of the American foods he had learned to prepare. He began serving hamburgers and hot dogs alongside pasta and risotto, creating a fusion cuisine that reflected his transformed worldview. His restaurant became a gathering place for other former POWs and curious locals who wanted to hear stories about America. The Hungarian prisoners faced even more complex challenges upon their return. Hungary was now under Soviet occupation, and the communist authorities viewed former POWs with suspicion. These men had spent years in the capitalist heartland, exposed to democratic ideas and American abundance. They were potential sources of counter-revolutionary sentiment, living reminders that alternatives to communist ideology existed. Sergeant Istvan Nagy, who had written so poignantly about his conflicted feelings during captivity, found himself under surveillance by the Hungarian secret police upon his return. His letters from America, which had described the abundance and freedom he had experienced, were used as evidence of his ideological contamination. He was forbidden from teaching his original profession and was assigned to work in a factory where his activities could be closely monitored. Despite the restrictions, Nagy and other Hungarian returnees found ways to share their experiences with trusted friends and family members. In whispered conversations and coded letters, they described the America they had known, a place where political dissent was tolerated, where economic opportunity was available to all, and where individual initiative was rewarded rather than punished. These accounts became part of the underground resistance to communist rule, contributing to the eventual democratic revolution that would sweep Eastern Europe decades later. The American authorities had anticipated the potential impact of returning POWs and had made deliberate efforts to maximize their influence as democratic ambassadors. The education programs in the camps had been designed not just to occupy the prisoners' time, but to create a cadre of Europeans who understood and appreciated American values. The generous treatment, the exposure to abundance, and the personal relationships formed during captivity were all part of a long-term strategy to win hearts and minds in post-war Europe. This strategy proved remarkably successful. Studies conducted by American intelligence agencies in the 1950s found that former POWs were among the most pro-American voices in European society. They served as informal ambassadors, countering Soviet propaganda with their own first-hand accounts of American society. Their influence extended far beyond their immediate families and communities, as their stories spread through social networks and contributed to the broader cultural transformation of post-war Europe. The economic impact of the POW experience was equally significant. Many former prisoners used the skills they had learned in America to start businesses or pursue careers that would have been impossible under the old European social order. They had seen how American society rewarded entrepreneurship and innovation, and they brought these lessons back to Europe. Some became successful businessmen, others became teachers or translators, and many simply became advocates for the kind of economic freedom they had witnessed in America. The story of Coca-Cola in post-war Europe illustrates the broader cultural impact of the POW experience. Former prisoners who had developed a taste for the drink during their captivity became some of its first customers when Coca-Cola began expanding into European markets in the late 1940s. They served as informal marketing agents, introducing friends and family to the beverage that had symbolized American abundance during their imprisonment. The success of Coca-Cola in Europe owed much to these early adopters who had learned to associate the drink with positive memories of their time in America. Hot dogs underwent a similar transformation. Italian former POWs introduced variations of the American hot dog to European cuisine, adapting the concept to local tastes and ingredients. The democratic nature of the hot dog, a simple food that could be enjoyed by anyone regardless of social class, appealed to societies that were rebuilding themselves along more egalitarian lines. Street vendors selling hot dogs became common in many European cities, often run by former POWs who had learned the trade in American camps. The personal relationships formed during captivity continued long after the war ended. Many former prisoners maintained correspondence with American guards, camp officials, and civilian friends they had made during their time in the United States. These relationships became bridges between cultures, facilitating understanding and cooperation during the Cold War period, when such connections were particularly valuable. Captain James Morrison, the education officer at Camp Shelby, received hundreds of letters from former prisoners over the years following the war. They described their struggles and successes in rebuilding their lives, their efforts to share democratic values with their communities, and their gratitude for the treatment they had received during captivity. Morrison kept these letters as testimony to the power of human decency to transcend the boundaries of war and nationality. The children of former POWs grew up hearing stories about America that shaped their own worldviews and aspirations. Many of these second-generation Europeans became advocates for Atlantic cooperation, supporters of NATO, and proponents of the democratic values their fathers had learned during captivity. The influence of the POW experience thus extended across generations, contributing to the long-term stability of the Western alliance. The psychological impact of the American experience on former POWs was complex and lasting. Many struggled with what psychologists would later recognize as a form of reverse culture shock. They had adapted to American abundance and freedom, only to return to societies marked by scarcity and authoritarian control. Some experienced depression and alienation as they tried to readjust to European life. Others channeled their frustration into political activism, working to bring about the changes that would make their home countries more like the America they had known. Giuseppe Benedetti eventually became a successful businessman in post-war Italy, importing American consumer goods and serving as a bridge between American companies and Italian markets. He never forgot the lesson of abundance he had learned at Camp Shelby, that prosperity was not a zero-sum game, that wealth could be created rather than simply redistributed, and that individual initiative could benefit entire societies. His business philosophy reflected these American values, and his success helped spread them throughout Italian society. The medical and nutritional impact of the POW experience was also significant. Many prisoners had arrived in America malnourished and in poor health after years of wartime deprivation. The abundant food and medical care they received during captivity restored their health and introduced them to American approaches to nutrition and health care. When they returned to Europe, they brought with them knowledge about vitamins, balanced diets, and preventive medicine that contributed to improvements in public health. The technological exposure that prisoners received in America also had lasting effects. They had worked with American machinery, observed American industrial processes, and learned about American approaches to manufacturing and agriculture. This knowledge proved valuable in the reconstruction of European industry, as former POWs served as consultants and advisors to companies seeking to modernize their operations along American lines. The cultural legacy of the POW experience extended into the arts and literature. Many former prisoners wrote memoirs describing their time in America, contributing to a genre of literature that helped shape European understanding of American society. These books, often bestsellers in their home countries, provided detailed accounts of American life that countered stereotypes and propaganda. They described not just the material abundance of America, but the values and attitudes that made such abundance possible. The religious impact of the POW experience was equally significant. Many prisoners had encountered American approaches to religious tolerance and pluralism that were foreign to their European experience. They had seen how Americans could hold strong religious beliefs while still respecting the rights of those who believed differently. This model of religious coexistence became influential in post-war Europe, contributing to the development of more tolerant and pluralistic societies. As the decades passed, the former POWs became living bridges between America and Europe. During the Cold War, when anti-American sentiment was common in many European countries, these men served as credible voices defending American values and policies. Their first-hand knowledge of American society gave them authority that no amount of official propaganda could match. They helped maintain the Atlantic Alliance during its most difficult periods by providing personal testimony about the benefits of cooperation with America. The story of the Italian and Hungarian POWs who couldn't believe Coca-Cola and hot dogs ultimately became a story about the power of human experience to transcend political boundaries and ideological differences. These men had arrived in America as enemies, convinced by propaganda that they would face brutality and deprivation. Instead, they discovered abundance, kindness, and respect for human dignity that challenged everything they had been taught about their enemies. Their transformation from prisoners to ambassadors, from enemies to friends, demonstrated the possibility of reconciliation and understanding, even in the midst of the world's most destructive conflict. The abundance they encountered, symbolized by simple pleasures like Coca-Cola and hot dogs, represented more than material prosperity. It represented a different way of organizing society, a different set of values, and a different vision of human possibility. The legacy of their experience continues to resonate today. In an era of renewed international tensions and cultural misunderstanding, their story reminds us that personal encounters and human relationships can bridge even the deepest divides. The Italian and Hungarian prisoners who discovered America behind barbed wire became proof that enemies can become friends, that understanding can overcome prejudice, and that the simple act of sharing a meal, even a hot dog and a Coca-Cola, can change the world. Their journey from the battlefields of North Africa and Eastern Europe to the prison camps of America and back to a transformed Europe was more than just a wartime episode. It was a testament to the transformative power of human decency, the importance of treating even enemies with dignity and respect, and the possibility that today's adversaries might become tomorrow's allies. In their story, we find hope for a world where understanding triumphs over hatred, where abundance is shared rather than hoarded, and where the simple pleasures of life, a cold drink on a hot day, a friendly meal shared between strangers, can serve as the foundation for lasting peace.